Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on another edition of Illinois Rising. Dan Proft. I'm the host of the Morning Answer program with Amy Jacobson, Monday to Friday, 5 to 9 a.m. And joining me this week on Illinois Rising is Pat Hughes. He's the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. And Pat, quite an eventful Tuesday night primary election in Illinois on both sides of the aisle, both Republican, Democrat. Unbelievable turnout. And some surprises at the regional level, even the statewide level, the local level. Maybe not as so much in terms of outcome, but definitely in terms of margin.
Yeah, turnout, as you mentioned, Dan, was way up. People are enthused by the election. I think that the Trump Cruz factor, the Sanders Clinton factor, Clinton being a home stater, really drove turnout here, and just all across the country.
And Bernie Sanders too. I mean, he closed hard on Hillary to come within a few thousand votes of her in her home state with heavy minority populations, which have been Hillary's firewall to this point. It seems, frankly, like the pandemonium that broke out at UIC the Friday before the election benefited both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it did. This is a different electorate. People are coming out. It's like, if you're not going to vote for Bernie Sanders, maybe you'll vote for Donald Trump in the general election. It's the strangest sort of crossover of an electorate. And it wasn't just the presidential election, Dan. There were some unbelievably key races here in Illinois, both in the Chicago area, downstate. You can feel sort of a landscape change politically, both nationally and in our state.
And when I'm not on the radio, I run a super PAC called Liberty Principles PAC. So I was involved in 8 state legislative races, and we'll get to those. And the Illinois Opportunity Project, Pat, co-founder of Illinois Opportunity Project, was involved in a material way in some legislative races, and we'll get to those as well. But now let's bring in Cole Lauterbach. Cole Lauterbach is a reporter with the Illinois News Network. Cole, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan, Pat. How are you guys?
Good.
Hey,
let's start with a legislative race that got a lot of attention because it contained the hopes and dreams of a lot of Republicans and, frankly, independent-minded Democrats. But it was never really a threat, as I said on this show many a time. But that was the race, Jason Gonzalez versus House Speaker Mike Madigan, where you had some outside money come in. I mean, Jason Gonzalez spent $1 million. I don't think $1 million has ever been spent against Mike Madigan in his home district. But I think there was a little bit of hoping against hope in some circles that this was going to be a competitive race. And we learned what we knew going in, which is Mike Madigan's legislative district is a controlled vote, even to some extent, like the state of Illinois has been a controlled vote under Mike Madigan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even speaking with Gonzalez, and I started off the day when the polls were still open at a polling place off of 63rd Street, which is probably right south of Midway, and it was. It was expected. I mean, you saw it was an interesting scene. I don't think I'd ever seen that many polling signs in my life, ever, or yard signs. I mean, there's hundreds of them out there. But it was, on the surface, like you said, it was everybody kind of, as expected, this is just one more candidate, smashed against the rocky shores of Madigan Island. But this is, the speaker's a guy, you got to think he plays long game. If you look at the results, if Madigan hadn't, from what Gonzalez has placed the 2 more candidates in there, Gonzalez would have collected those votes, it's got to be assumed, and he would have finished with 8,800 votes, which, with the huge turnout this year, that's good for a third of the vote. And 4 years ago, Madigan faced his last primary challenger, if you remember, her name was Michelle Pizer. You combine her vote totals with the 2 dummy candidates in that race, and that was around 3,100 votes, and that's only 25%. So in 4 years, you look at the math, he went from 75% to 66% of a vote. That's not exactly the beating that everybody was expecting when arguably the most powerful man in the state goes nuclear on a first-time unknown candidate.
So, Cole, it's Pat. Then, giving that trend, or at least the trend you suggest, how do you get to 50 plus 1 to beat the guy? Because he's always going to have the machine. He's always going to have a controlled vote. He's always going to put up other candidates.
Well, in addition to that, Cole, let's be real honest. Michelle Pizer, in terms of that comparison, non-presidential year, number one. Number two, she didn't have $1 million behind her. She had about $30,000 behind her. So what kind of money would it take? Is there enough money in the Western civilization? I mean, I think my point about this is, rather than tilting at windmills, as a lot of folks did with Mike Madigan, which I said was tilting at windmills from the get, this was fool's gold from the beginning. We need to do the heavy lifting of winning state legislative races we should be winning around the state, rather than playing Sisyphus to Mike Madigan in his little district by Midway Airport.
I agree. I think that granted, Pizer did not have the money that Gonzalez had going into this, and even speaking with Gonzalez, he said, "Look, I am not shocked that I did not win this race," but he was proud of the fact that he got more votes than he thinks anybody expected of him. And Pizer also did, if you remember, I believe now late Jack Roser put a couple $100,000 into her race. He's the Family Taxpayer Foundation.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't quite that much, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so he did. There was a little bit of money behind her, but that was also contextually a completely different era of campaign spending. I mean, in a time when you've got $5 million being spent on Juliana Stratton and Ken Duncan in a state legislative primary, that's more than Hillary Clinton's planning on spending in all of Arizona.
Yeah. So Cole, it's Pat. So have you talked to Jason? Because one of the criticisms of any legislative race, or particularly a race where you'd have to make up so much ground here, is that, the guy started very late. He wasn't well organized. So, late money came his way. But that isn't how you're going to ultimately beat Mike Madigan. Has he started the plan for campaigning for 2018 already? Because that's what he'd have to do. He'd have to start tomorrow or yesterday to get that going. Have you spoke to him? What are his intentions? Is he going to run again? And if he is he prepared to put in the long work, which would start right away?
Well, when I spoke to Jason, one of the last questions I'd asked him was really, what's next? And he said, well, I plan on taking some time off and getting married and having some kids, but he still said he loves politics. He feels that his district, which he's spent a lot of time, he owns a place there obviously now, and he said that this is his calling. So he plans on, you haven't heard the last of a guy like Jason Gonzalez. He didn't say that he was, announcing his candidacy for the next primary already, but he definitely made the impression that he was going to continue to fight this battle. If he did decide that he was going to get into this and get that early start and really start pushing, it's obviously, like Dan said, tilting at windmills to go against the speaker in his own home district, where you had this year, even with the huge turnout, you had 24,000 votes, in which 16,000 went to Mike Madigan. If you're going to spend money on trying to defeat that machine, I don't necessarily know that trying to beat Mike Madigan in his home territory is going to do it. But Gonzalez definitely, I don't think you've heard the last of him, and I think he will probably come back in one form or fashion. I don't know if it'll be state representative, but you can definitely bank on the fact you haven't heard the last of him.
All right, he's Cole Lauterbach, a reporter for the Illinois News Network. Cole, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Pat, I want to pick up on a couple of other races, too, are important. Cole just mentioned one, Ken Duncan versus Julia Stratton. This is a proxy fight between Mike Madigan and Bruce Rauner, and apparently the President of the United States, too, who weighed in on that race, something that is just incredible, frankly. But Ken Duncan gets wiped out after being in the General Assembly for 13 years and being a Madigan loyalist, supported by Madigan for a long time until he broke with Madigan on a couple of issues, and that's when it was time for him to be eliminated. And he was. Illinois Opportunity Project was involved in that race. Give us your assessment of that race and I mean a 35-point blowout loss for Ken Duncan. Why even get involved?
Yeah, so you get involved. We spent on Illinois Opportunity Project, put a lot of money into that race, and it was based on principle. Ken Duncan stood with the governor on SB 1229. As you know, Dan, that bill would have taken the governor's ability to negotiate the new ASME contract away from the governor. Of course, that's what the Democrats and ASME wanted, and Duncan stood against Mike Madigan on that, which is why he got this push from Stratton and the president and everything else. And he also was a school choice guy, and those are things that the Illinois Opportunity Project we value. And if we're going to put a stake in the ground, and I think this might be why some of the people were putting money into Jason Gonzalez, you have to stand on principle. Duncan ostensibly was standing for our principles. There was an opportunity there for us to say something's got to change in the Democratic Party, and this is a vehicle for that change. And he showed the ability to change within the party. And so we supported him, and I'm proud that we did.
I want to turn to another race, another proxy fight, this between Governor Rauner and the public sector unions, who, of course, largely are the financiers of Mike Madigan and the Chicago Democrats, but also finance Republicans that are willing to do their bidding. So down in the Springfield area, west to the St. Louis border, there was a state Senate primary. We just talked about Duncan and Stratton being the most expensive state rep race in Illinois history. I think we had the most expensive Republican state Senate primary in Illinois history in Sam McCann, the incumbent, versus Bryce Benton, the challenger. Sam McCann narrowly wins, 52-48, basically. And this seen as another defeat for Governor Rauner. So the Duncan race seen as a defeat, the McCann Benton race seen as a defeat. I, with Liberty Principles PAC, was a big supporter of Bryce Benton. I independently spent north of $3 million in advance of Bryce Benton's campaign. An Illinois Opportunity Project was aligned on that as well. So is that a major defeat? How do we explain Sam McCann holding on against Bryce Benton with all that money behind him?
Well, look, I thought Bryce Benton was a great guy. I think he's a good candidate. He was new, so there was a lot of a ramp that had to go up to get him ID'd. I thought that that was a fight absolutely worth fighting, and was happy that you were able to independently do what you did. Is it a defeat for the governor? I don't think so. I think what the governor has said in his support of Benton against McCann is, look, if you're going to go and support Democrat policies, and you're going to support the public sector unions that are bankrupting our state, there are going to be consequences. And sometimes those consequences, and ultimately, in my opinion, will result in electoral victories. This time it didn't, but a message has been sent, and it also shows the willingness to fight on these principles. And those are important things. So for me, I don't think the governor, he lost that particular race, and your PAC lost that race, and people who supported Bryce lost that race. But in the long game, I think it's a win. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think it's a battle and a war. Sam McCann won fair and square, and I congratulate him on his victory. But the idea that his model of representation, the inability to distinguish between representing public sector workers and families who live in your district versus being a toady to the public sector union bosses and being a wholly owned subsidiary of them, which is what Sam McCann had become, which is why he's the only Republican in either chamber in the General Assembly to be endorsed by the AFL-CIO. If you're going to have Republicans that serve as enemies inside your perimeter voting with Chicago Democrats like Cullerton and Madigan on matters of trying to restructure state government, in other words, voting against restructuring state government, voting against Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda, then what's the point? You destroy the party from within, and you make the Republican Party what it's been for so long, which is why it's in the super minority in both chambers, sort of indistinguishable from the Democrats. It's about presenting a choice. So it was unfortunate to lose that race. I agree with you that Bryce Benton's a good candidate and a good person. And you know what? Sometimes good candidates and good people lose races. And sometimes bad candidates and bad people win races. This is why we have the political culture we have. But I agree with you. It was worth the gamble. It was worth the fight. I don't regret it from Liberty Principles PAC. I don't think the governor regrets it. And frankly, to your point about the message being sent, for others who are contemplating becoming a Quisling like McCann, just know that you'll have, millions of dollars put against you if good other Republican conservative candidates can be found, and we'll see if we can't turn you out. And I bet we'll turn people out more often than we won't. And it's important to have internal accountability mechanisms in the party. It's something we've lacked for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with all that. First of all, I agree that good candidates lose elections. Otherwise, I'd be a U.S. senator and you'd be governor of the state. But on the money,
I don't know if those are quality examples, but yeah.
Those are the first ones that came to mind.
Yeah, in that order, too.
On the money issue, it's important, too, because why does Sam McCann leave the party, right? He leaves the party because he thinks that's where he's going to get structural, financial, and other support. So what the governor is doing is he's sending a message, both if you cross us, where we have the resources, but also to the people who are now in this new sort of environment where where before the Senate Republicans never had the resources to help. The governor is saying, look, there are, and groups like yours, there are resources out there to support you if you support good public policy. And we showed it in the McCann race. This way, these legislators, if they think about going in a different direction with the Democrats, maybe they can think twice, not just because they're going to get pummeled in the negative, but because there's financial resources to support them to do the right thing, too, if they choose to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is worth noting as well, just from my PAC's perspective, is in 2012, we supported Sam McCann's reelection. But we told him the same thing we tell all the candidates we support. All we want you to do is go to Springfield and be the person you said you would be, fight for the economic liberty policy agenda the way you said you would were you elected or reelected. And if you don't, understand that we're going to find or attempt to find somebody who will do those things, because we don't believe you're the only person who could possibly be a state senator from your district. And McCann didn't do it. He decided to be somebody different than he said he would be. And so we supported an opponent. So, I mean, that's also kind of abiding our commitment to our donors and commitment to what we're disseminating publicly to say this is going to be an accountability mechanism. We want vessels for the economic liberty policy agenda, and that's what politicians are. They're vessels for a policy agenda, either our policy agenda or somebody else's. And I've just found it fascinating to see the response from the institutional investors, if you will, in Springfield that it's okay if the public sector unions spend tens of millions of dollars. It's okay if Mike Madigan and John Cullerton spend millions of dollars and the trial lawyers spend millions of dollars. But when people who want to advance an economic liberty policy agenda spend a lot of money in support of candidates, now that's somehow bad. Now we have to get the money out of politics. The hypocrisy that supporting some of these opponents against institutional candidates like McCann has exposed, I think, is also very useful for the body politic to understand in Illinois.
Yeah, and the landscape is changing, Dan, and it's changing too fast for the people that you just mentioned. The financial landscape is changing, and they're trying to get their head around it. They're trying to get their head around the idea that center-right people and liberty-principled candidates and the governor are resourced in a way that they've never been resourced in their lifetime, and their heads are spinning. They don't know how to deal with it, so they say the things that you say. Oh, only unions should have the money. You shouldn't have the money. They say things like dark money. It's all of these sort of pejoratives because the landscape's changing so fast, and their little kingdom that they've been able to protect is starting to shift under their feet.
And one other, just on a point of privilege, one other race that Liberty Principles PAC was involved in, we actually, the 6 of the 8 candidates, I should say, that we supported won. McCann defeating the candidate we supported in Bryce Benton, and then in Western Illinois, we backed a candidate who was unsuccessful as well. But one other proxy fight was in Southern Illinois, Brad Hallbrook versus Jim Acklin, mainly. That was his main opponent. Jim Acklin backed by Governor Edgar. Jim Acklin backed by the teachers' unions. And we had this in a bunch of races where we were up against union-backed Republican challengers. And Jim Edgar endorsed Jim Acklin and did commercials for him. And not only did Brad Hallbrook defeat Jim Acklin and the teachers' union financiers, Jim Edgar, the former governor Jim Edgar, the sainted Jim Edgar, according to kind of the moribund GOP establishment in this state, he lost his delegate race. He's not a delegate at the convention. He was a Jeb Bush delegate. You had a former governor lose his delegate race. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.